Video info. The Battle of Narva. How a teenage king changed Europe's destiny. Discover how genius and nature united at the Battle of Narva, shaping the history of Northern Europe. Channel info. Military history and warfare tactics. English. The introduction builds a gripping narrative, highlighting the historical significance of the Battle of Narva and the unique role of a young king. The tension between unequal forces is palpable, making the viewer curious about the tactics and decisions that led to a surprising outcome. The use of elements like blizzard and brains versus brawn suggests the video will explore not only the events, but also the lessons learned, which could attract an audience interested in history and strategy. The Russian lines stretch to the south and southwest of Narva. The town is surrounded. The Swedish garrison is trapped. Supplies are running low. From the Russian perspective, this is only a matter of time. The fortress will fall. It's math. It's logic. It's inevitable. But math doesn't account for Charles XII. Charles XII of Sweden is 18 years old. 18. The age when most young men are learning to ride a horse, he is ruling a kingdom. The age when most guys are making career decisions, he is making decisions about war and peace. The age when most teenagers are trying to impress friends, he is trying to save a fortress from an army 4 times larger. When the news of the siege of Narva reaches Stockholm, the military advisors hesitate. Some suggest negotiations. Others propose waiting for reinforcements. Some even murmur about abandoning Narva and defending stronger positions. Charles XII hears it all, and then he makes the decision that defines his reign. He will personally lead a relief force to Narva. The force Charles XII gathers is modest. 10,500 men, trained infantry, loyal cavalry, but small, very small. The numbers are clear. 10,500 against 34,000 to 40,000. A 3-to-1 disadvantage. Maybe 4-to-1. Any seasoned commander would look at those numbers and withdraw. Any sensible general would seek alternatives. Any rational strategist would postpone the attack. Charles XII is not rational, he is bold. As the Swedish force moves toward Narva in late autumn, the season is changing. Winter is coming. Temperatures are dropping. The wind is getting stronger, and clouds are gathering. It's the kind of weather that makes armies stop and encamp. It's the kind of weather that makes generals delay battles. It's the kind of weather most people fear. Charles XIV sees opportunity. When the Swedes come within sight of Narva, Charles XIV does what any good commander would do. He studies the battlefield. He observes the Russian siege lines, and he sees something Duke Eugene of Croy didn't notice. Something Boris Sheremetev didn't consider. Something 37,000 Russian soldiers fail to see. The siege lines are stretched too thin. To encircle Narva completely, the Russian army had to spread out for miles, south, southwest, dispersed positions connected by trenches and palisades. It's an impressive formation when seen from afar. But up close, it's vulnerable. Because an effective siege requires concentration. It requires overlap. It requires that each position can quickly support the others. The Russian lines don't have that. They are extended. They are isolated. And crucially, they cannot defend all positions simultaneously. Charles XIII sees this, and he sees one more thing. A blizzard is approaching. 18th century meteorologists don't exist. There are no satellites. There are no forecast models. But there are signs. Air pressure, the color of the sky, the direction of the wind. And Charles XIV, or his weather advisors, can read those signs. A snowstorm is coming. And it's not just any snowstorm. It's a storm with wind blowing from behind the Swedish positions and straight into the Russian faces. This is not merely bad weather. This is a weapon. On an 18th century battlefield, visibility is everything. Artillery depends on line of sight. Musketeers depend on seeing their targets. Commanders depend on seeing their soldiers. Without visibility, coordination collapses. Without coordination, armies become mobs, and mobs don't win battles. Charles XIII understands this viscerally. If the blizzard arrives as expected, the Russian gunners will be blinded. Russian soldiers won't be able to see the approaching Swedish columns. Russian commanders won't be able to coordinate the defense. And those overextended siege lines, they will become death traps. Isolated positions that can't call for help. Isolated positions that can't retreat in an organized way. Isolated positions that can be attacked and destroyed one by one. This is the plan. Attack now. Attack fast. Attack under the cover of the storm. Use the weather as a force multiplier. Turn numerical disadvantage into irrelevance. Make 10,500 soldiers seem like 100,000 through chaos, confusion, and white blindness. The Swedish military advisors hear the plan. Some are skeptical. Attack in a blizzard? Attack against 3-to-1 odds? Attack fortified positions? It's madness. It's suicide. It's genius. Because Charles IV isn't just betting on the weather. He's betting on human nature. He's betting that the Russian soldiers, already exhausted from weeks of siege, already uncomfortable in late November cold, already stretched across overly long lines, will panic when attacked by an invisible enemy in a raging snowstorm. He's betting that confusion will spread faster than orders. He is betting that fear is more contagious than discipline. He is betting that a storm can do more than any artillery. The calendar shows November 30th, 1700. The time is approaching 2 in the afternoon. The sky darkens, the wind picks up, and the first snowflakes begin to fall. Light at first, then heavier, then blinding. Visibility collapses. 30 meters, 20 meters, 10 meters. The blizzard arrives as predicted, and Charles V gives the order that will change everything. Attack. The Swedes advance in 2 columns, infantry and cavalry coordinated. There is no wild charge, no premature battle cry. There is only silent, deliberate movement through the blinding snow. The Russian soldiers in the siege lines can barely see 3 meters in front of them. They hear something, a muffled sound. Footsteps? Horses? Wind? They are not sure. They alert the officers. The officers try to organize a response. But how do you organize a defense when you can't see the attacker? The Russian artillery, which should devastate any relieving force approaching, is silent. Not because they lack ammunition, not because they lack courage, but because the gunners simply cannot aim. They cannot see the targets. They cannot adjust their fire. They can do nothing but wait and pray that the storm passes. But the storm does not pass. It intensifies. And under its cover, the Swedes attack. The Swedish king sees what the Russians do not. The siege lines, spread too thin, are about to become a death trap. What should be a position of strength, besieging a town, is about to become a position of extreme weakness. Because when you are spread out for miles and cannot see the enemy coming, you are not surrounding anything. You are just waiting to be destroyed. Charles IV, at 18, turned a snowstorm into artillery. He transformed bad weather into strategy. He made nature an ally. And now, with 10,500 men advancing through the blinding snow, he is about to prove that tactical brilliance is worth more than numerical superiority. The battle for Narva's survival is only beginning. And on the other side of those siege lines, 37,000 Russians still do not realize that the blizzard is not just weather. It is a death sentence. It is 2 in the afternoon, November 30th, 1700. What began as a cold late autumn morning in Estonia is about to turn into something completely different. Something the Russian army, spread for miles around Narva, is not prepared to face. The wind begins to shift. At first, it's just a gust, then another. The Swedish defenders inside Narva's fortress feel the wind at their backs, coming from the north, pushing them toward the Russian siege lines. And then, as if nature itself had taken a side in this battle, the sky darkens. Thick, snow-laden clouds roll over the battlefield like a gray wave. The blizzard arrives. And it does not arrive gently. It comes like a wall of white, swallowing everything in its path. Snow begins to fall. Heavy, dense, relentless. Within minutes, visibility on the field collapses. You can't see 30 feet ahead. You can't see the enemy lines. You can't see your own troops just a few steps away. Charles V is watching. He sees the wind at the Swedes' backs. He sees the snow hitting the Russians' faces, and he sees the opportunity. Because the wind isn't just weather. It's geometry. It's physics applied to war. When you have the wind at your back and your enemy has the wind in their face, you are not just fighting soldiers. You are fighting with nature on your side. The snow blinds the Russians. The snow conceals the Swedish advance. The snow turns an impossible battle into a possible one. And Charles XII, at 18, understands this with a clarity that commanders with decades of experience lack. He turns to Lieutenant General Carl Gustav Renskiold. This man is no novice. Renskiold is a master of tactical execution, an officer who turns plans into reality on the battlefield. And the plan Charles XII has just approved is as simple as it is brutal. 2 coordinated attacks, 2 columns of Swedish troops, both advancing simultaneously toward the overextended Russian siege lines, both using the blizzard as cover. The aim is not to push the Russians back. The aim is to break their lines, to penetrate the siege positions, create chaos where there was order, and do it all before the Russians realize what is happening. Renskiold gives the orders. The drums begin to beat, and 10,500 Swedish soldiers begin to move. They advance through the blinding snow, infantry up front, cavalry on the flanks. Column formation, tight, disciplined. The Swedish lines do not break. They do not falter. They keep advancing, step by step, through the storm that now dominates the battlefield. On the Russian side, everything is different. Inside the siege lines, the Russian soldiers cannot see what is coming. Snow is slapping their faces. The wind is roaring in their ears. And the Russian artillery, which should be their first line of defense, is completely blind. Because 18th century artillery does not work without line of sight. You need to see your target. You need to calculate the distance. You need to adjust the angle. And when you cannot see beyond 10 meters, you cannot do any of that. The Russian artillery crews are staring through the snow, desperately trying to find something to fire at. But all they see is white. White in every direction. White where enemy troops should be. White where targets should be. And then suddenly, there's no time left. The Swedish columns emerge from the blizzard like ghosts. They're about 50 meters from the Russian lines. Then 40 meters. Then 30 meters. And the Russians, spread out for miles in siege positions never meant to defend against an external assault, realize they're about to be hit. The first impact is devastating. Swedish infantry strikes the Russian lines like a hammer. They aren't fighting in the open. They're fighting inside the very siege positions of the Russians, where space is tight, where numbers don't matter, where the only thing that counts is who's more organized, more disciplined, more ready for this moment. And the Swedes are ready. They break the first Russian line in minutes, then the second. The siege works that looked so impressive from a distance reveal themselves for what they really are when attacked from outside. A series of isolated positions, stretched too thin, unable to support one another. Duke Eugene of Croy, the Flemish officer commanding the Russian field operations, sees what's happening. He watches his lines collapse. He sees confusion spreading. He tries to rally his troops. He sends orders. He shouts commands through the snowstorm. But nobody can hear, nobody can see, and nobody can coordinate an effective defense when you're spread out for miles and the enemy is inside your positions. The second Swedish column strikes the Russian left flank. Boris Sheremetev, commander of the Russian cavalry, tries to organize a defense. But cavalry needs room to maneuver. It needs visibility to charge. And in this blizzard, with Swedish infantry already inside the Russian lines, there's no room, no visibility, only chaos. Sheremetev's cavalry is engulfed by the confusion. Some horsemen try to charge and collide with their own troops. Others pull back and crash into other Russian units retreating toward them. The flank doesn't hold. It doesn't collapse. It simply ceases to exist as a coherent fighting force. 30 minutes. It takes just 30 minutes from the first impact to the decisive breakthrough. 30 minutes to turn a confident Russian siege into a nightmare of confusion and panic. 30 minutes to prove that numerical superiority counts for nothing when you can't see, can't coordinate, and can't defend positions that are stretched too thin. Inside the collapsing siege lines, Russian soldiers are making survival choices. Some try to fight, some try to withdraw. Most simply try not to die in the coming hours. And as the siege works disintegrate, as the Swedish lines push deeper, as communication between Russian units breaks down completely, a single truth becomes clear to everyone on the battlefield. The siege is over. Not because the Swedes forced an orderly Russian retreat, not because they negotiated a withdrawal, but because the siege lines simply stopped existing as defensible positions. The Russians still fighting are not defending a siege. They're trying not to be encircled themselves. Duke Eugene of Croy makes a last attempt to gather his forces. He tries to form a defensive line. He tries to create some kind of order out of the chaos. But it's too late. Russian troops no longer answer orders. They answer instinct. And instinct is telling one thing: get out of here. The retreat begins. It's not orderly. It's not coordinated. It's a mass flight of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, all trying to get away from siege lines that have become traps, all trying to reach safety. And there's only one viable escape route: the Narva River. East of the siege lines, running beside the fortress of Narva, is the river that now represents Russia's only hope of escaping the disaster. But crossing a river at the end of November, in the middle of a blizzard, with an army in panic, isn't a military operation. It's a catastrophe waiting to happen. And as the Russian troops begin to run toward the river, as the siege works are completely abandoned, as the Russian artillery is left behind because there's no time to move it, Charles V and his Swedish troops begin to realize the scale of what they've just achieved. They didn't just break the siege. They destroyed an army. The siege positions are empty. The Russian guns are silent, abandoned in place. And between the battlefield and the Narva River, thousands of Russian soldiers are fleeing, many throwing down their weapons to run faster, many already lost in the blizzard, many about to discover that crossing a river in panic is as deadly as facing the enemy. Duke Eugene of Croy, the Belgian commander who led the Russian siege, is not among those fleeing. He's among the captured. Caught in the collapse of the lines, unable to escape, he is now a prisoner of the Swedes. The man who commanded 37,000 Russian soldiers just an hour ago is now in Swedish custody. The battle, at least the part that matters, is over. But the real cost is yet to come. Because as the retreating Russian troops reach the banks of the Narva River, as they realize they must cross that icy water in the middle of a snowstorm, as thousands of men try to cross at once without order, without leadership, without coordination, the retreat is about to turn into something much, much worse. The river is waiting, and the river shows no mercy. The Narva River is not waiting patiently. It has no intention of mercy. And at this moment, as tens of thousands of panicked Russian soldiers reach its icy banks, it's about to become the final grave for thousands. Picture the scene. You've just watched your siege lines collapse in less than 30 minutes. You saw men around you fall to Swedish bayonets, to sword strikes, in the absolute chaos of a blizzard that turned your army into blind targets. You're running now. Running through the snow, through the biting wind, through absolute terror. And ahead of you is the Narva River, freezing water, a fierce current, and no orders, no coordination, no leadership. Because Duke Eugene of Croy isn't here to organize the retreat. He's captured. Boris Sheremetev and his left flank cavalry have already been routed. The commanders who could have set up an orderly crossing, who could have formed ranks, who could have saved thousands of lives, they're dead or captive. And what's left is pure chaos. Thousands of men try to cross the river at once. Some try to swim. Others try to form human chains. Many simply plunge into the water in total panic, without thinking, without planning, just trying to escape. The weight of their armor pulls men under. The cold stiffens muscles in seconds. The current sweeps soldiers downstream like dolls, and they drown. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, drowning not in glorious combat, not holding positions, not fighting for their lives, but simply trying to get away. The Narva crossing becomes a liquid cemetery. The Swedes, surprisingly, don't pursue with full force. Charles V could have ordered a relentless chase. He could have sent his cavalry to slaughter the Russians as they tried to cross. But he doesn't need to. The victory is already total, absolute, undeniable. A pursuit would be wasting energy on an enemy already destroyed. Instead, the Swedes do something far more strategic. They capture 20,000 Russian prisoners, 20,000 men who just hours earlier were part of a besieging force of 37,000 soldiers. Now they're in Swedish custody, disarmed, defeated, taken on the battlefield or nearby as they tried to flee. 20,000 prisoners. Think about that number. This isn't just a defeat. This is the capture of more than half the original Russian army. It's a complete institutional collapse. An army that arrived to besiege a fortress, confident in its numerical superiority, is now being processed as mass prisoners of war. And then there are the dead, the wounded, the real toll of the Battle of Narva. 10,000 Russians, dead or wounded severely enough to be counted among the casualties. 10,000 men whose families will never see them again, or will see them return maimed, blind, crippled by combat wounds. That's the cost of underestimating an 18-year-old king. That's the price of stretching siege lines too thin, of ignoring tactical vulnerability, of having no plan for when the enemy uses the weather as a weapon. 10,000 dead or wounded, 20,000 captured. From a besieging force of 37,000, only a few thousand managed to escape intact across the Narva. The Russian force was annihilated, and the Swedes? 600 to 700 dead, 1,200 wounded. From an army of 10,500 men, Swedish losses are remarkably low. Yes, 1,200 wounded is significant. Yes, 600 dead is a painful loss. But compare that to 10,000 Russians dead or wounded. Compare that to 20,000 captured. The casualty ratio is 10 to 1. By some counts, 15 to 1. For every Swede who fell, 10 to 15 Russians fell. This is not just a victory. This is one of the most lopsided casualty ratios in European military history. This is absolute tactical dominance. And then there's the captured equipment. The entire Russian artillery train. Every cannon. Every piece of siege artillery the Russians brought to break Narva's walls. All now in Swedish hands. The Russians couldn't even withdraw their heavy guns. They abandoned everything on the field. Cannons, supplies, tents, ammunition, everything. Duke Eugene of Croy, the Flemish field commander who led the Russian siege operations, is now sitting in a Swedish tent as a prisoner. The man who commanded 37,000 soldiers just hours before is now being interrogated by the same men who destroyed his army. The humiliation is total. And then you realize what really happened here. An 18-year-old king just validated every tactical decision he made. Charles the Franks of Sweden wasn't lucky. He didn't have fortunate chance. He planned. He waited. He identified the weakness in the Russian siege lines. He recognized that a blizzard wasn't just bad weather. It was a force-multiplying weapon if used correctly. He coordinated a two-pronged attack that exploited the Russians' overextended positions. And he executed it all with brutal precision. 18 years old. Think about that. At 18, most people are trying to figure out how to navigate adult life. Charles XIV was commanding armies, making life-and-death decisions, facing odds of 3 to 1 or 4 to 1, and turning those odds into a 10 to 1 victory. Charles XIV's tactical ingenuity was validated absolutely. He didn't win because he had more men. He won because he used the weather, the geography, and the enemy's vulnerability better than any Russian commander had anticipated. He turned a blizzard into a natural smokescreen. He turned stretched siege lines into a breaking point. He turned numerical disadvantage into irrelevance. This is not just one of the most lopsided victories in military history. This is a demonstration that tactical brilliance combined with environmental awareness beats sheer numerical superiority. This is proof that leadership matters, that innovation matters, that recognizing when nature is on your side and exploiting it ruthlessly can change the outcome of entire wars. Because this battle was not just about Narva. It was about the Great Northern War, and the Great Northern War was only beginning. Charles XIV's victory at Narva changed the trajectory of the entire 20-year conflict. This was the opening battle, the first major clash, and Sweden didn't just win, it dominated. Charles V's reputation as a tactical genius was cemented across Europe that day. At 18, he became a legend. Commanders in Vienna, in Paris, in London, all heard about Narva. All heard about the young Swedish king who used a snowstorm to crush a Russian army 3 times the size of his own. And Peter the Great? Peter the Great, who had set out on September 16, 1700, 2 months before the battle. He received the news of Narva in absolute shock. His army, shattered. His field commander, captured. His artillery train, lost. His ambition to expand westward into the Baltic, brutally halted. But Peter the Great was not a man to accept defeat passively. Narva enraged him, it humiliated him, and it motivated him. In the years that followed, Peter unleashed massive military reforms in Russia. He modernized the army, reorganized command, and imported Western expertise. Narva was the catalyst, the defeat that forced Russia to transform militarily. And eventually, years later, those reforms would lead to Russian successes later in the Great Northern War. But at the end of November 1700, on that snowy battlefield outside Narva, Russia was broken. And Sweden was triumphant. Baltic power dynamics were secured for the next decade. Sweden held its dominance over the Baltic territories. Narva remained under Swedish control, and Charles X continued his campaign with the confidence of a commander who knew he could face impossible odds and win. The European consequences were profound. Other nations watched. Denmark, which had been part of the anti-Swedish coalition at the start of the Great Northern War, recalculated. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth took note. The Ottoman Empire, always watching European power shifts, noticed. Sweden was not just a regional power. It was a military power led by a tactical genius. And it all started with a snowstorm, with an 18-year-old king, with 500 men facing 37, XII. With the decision to attack precisely when the weather became a weapon. So how did 500 Swedes defeat 37, XII Russians? First, tactical ingenuity. Charles IX's two-pronged attack wasn't luck. It was deliberate planning that exploited the weakness of the Russian siege lines. He identified that the Russians had overextended their positions and couldn't defend every point simultaneously. And he struck from two different angles to maximize confusion and prevent coordinated defense. Second, exploitation of the siege lines. The Russians were besieging Narva, which meant their forces were spread around the fortress. That created vulnerability. Instead of being concentrated in a strong defensive position, the Russian army was dispersed. Charles X turned the extent of the Russian siege lines into their greatest weakness. Third, wielding the weather. The snowstorm wasn't just luck. Charles X waited for it. He recognized that the wind favored the Swedes and blew into the faces of the Russians. He knew the heavy snow would blind Russian gunners, make accurate aiming impossible, and provide cover for Swedish assault columns to advance unseen. He turned a natural phenomenon into a force multiplier. Fourth, personal leadership. Charles X was 18, but he commanded in person. He didn't delegate from afar. He was there. His troops knew their king was with them on the battlefield. That matters. That builds morale. That creates resolve. And that day, Swedish resolve overcame Russian numbers. The uncomfortable truth is this: the victory was not luck. It was the calculated exploitation of every available advantage. It was recognizing that winning isn't about having more men. Winning is about using what you have better than the enemy can respond. The lesson of Narva is clear. Tactical brilliance combined with environmental awareness beats brute numerical superiority. Numbers matter, but leadership matters more. Innovation matters more. Recognizing the right moment to strike, recognizing when nature is on your side, recognizing the enemy's weakness and exploiting it mercilessly. That matters more. This is how the greatest commanders in history turn impossible odds into legendary victories. Not by waiting for perfect conditions, not by waiting until they have numerical superiority, but by recognizing when each element, weather, terrain, timing, enemy vulnerability, aligns, and then striking with brutal precision. Narva was not just a battle. It was a masterclass in tactical command. A demonstration that youth isn't weakness when paired with intelligence, proof that ingenuity can defeat brute force, and a reminder that in war, as in life, the winner isn't always the strongest. It's the smartest. Charles XVIII was 18 years old when he changed the course of European history. 18 when he faced 3-to-1 odds and turned them into a 10-to-1 casualty ratio in his favor. 18 when he proved that tactical genius doesn't wait for age. And November 30th, 1700 was etched into history as the day a snowstorm became Europe's deadliest weapon. This is the moment when ingenuity defeats brute force. This is the moment when leadership overcomes numbers. And this is exactly the kind of battle that defines not just wars, but centuries. If you're fascinated by battles where the tactical brilliance overcame overwhelming numerical superiority, where commanders turned disadvantages into victories, where history was shaped not by force but by intelligence, then you're in the right place. Subscribe for more decisive battles where ingenuity triumphed over brute force. because history is full of these moments, and each one carries lessons that still resonate today. The next time someone says numbers decide wars, remember Narva. Remember Charles the 14th. Remember 500 Swedes facing 37 Warozoran Russians. And remember that when tactical brilliance meets the right moment, numbers become irrelevant.